Hello, welcome to our English at Leeds Trinity podcast. I'm Richard Storer, I'm a lecturer in English at Leeds Trinity. We're working our way through the alphabet with an episode for each letter in the alphabet and one or two other letters that aren't in the alphabet. And this week we've arrived at C, and we are going to do that on C is for something which is a very big part of English at Leeds Trinity. C is for creative writing. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to think about C is for coronation. We're going to look at an example of creative writing, which is the poem written for the coronation by the poet laureate Simon Armitage. So C is for coronation, C is for creative writing. Now, with me today, first of all, I'd like to say welcome to Yvonne, who is here.
Hello.
And has been in lots of our episodes already. And then I'm very pleased that we've got three new guests here today, and I'm just going to introduce them. So two of our guests are people who have had a lot to do with creative writing becoming part of English at Leeds Trinity. So there's Oz Hardwick.
Hello.
And Amina Alyal.
Hello.
And then I'm very pleased also that we are joined by Lucy, who is someone who has done a degree in creative writing here at Leeds Trinity, and now you are doing a PhD that involves creative writing. So it'll be really interesting to hear about that.
Hello.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for being with us, and Yvonne as well. So I thought before we actually hear a bit more about creative writing and the experience of doing it from Oz and Lucy and Amina, who are so much involved in it, we might just do what we've been trying to do in each of our episodes, which is just bring the Oxford English Dictionary into it a little bit, because it is such a fascinating resource for everything to do with English. And so I thought it might be quite interesting to focus on the word creative, which perhaps we kind of take for granted. But one of the interesting things about the OED is that it always tells you when the word is first found in English. So they have found the earliest they can example of it in writing. Doesn't mean to say it wasn't around before then, but that's the earliest example of it being used in writing that they can find. And so I've looked this up already, but I'm going to ask everybody to have a guess when they think the first appearance of the word creative is in the English language. So let's open it up. Everyone, do you want to have a go to start with?
Yeah, I'm going to say that it's going to be around the 1100s or the 1000s.
About 1100s. Oz?
I go back that far as well, because I'm thinking, my interest in literature is very much sort of later medieval, and I'm thinking of, words like créature and so on. So I'm guessing it probably does come in our earliest written English, I would have thought.
Right, so you're going about 1100?
Yeah, whenever these things are written down, these early ones, sort of manuscripts from the 11th century, whatever.
Yeah. How about you, Lucy?
I would definitely say the same. Probably the 11th century, pushing 12th. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we're all in the kind of 1100s, I think. How about you, Amina?
Yes, I'd probably go along with that. I mean, I could come in with 1312.
1312.
Yes.
Well, there is a 13 in it, is the answer, but it is actually 1513.
Oh.
So actually quite a bit later than what everybody was guessing. It's from an author called J. Ireland, Mirror of Wisdom, and the sentence is infinite perfection in him the power creative. Only because it's a Middle English text, that V is actually a U.
Right, yes.
As we often find here when reading Middle English and even early modern English texts. So I guess the earliest example of the word creative, they're in a religious context. Sounds to me like that. But I guess the word create probably have been around before, and the other ones that you're thinking of. Mm. And it is a word that is coming into us from Latin, from the Romance languages. And in fact, it seems to come, it's obviously in two parts, create and iv, but it comes ready-made in those two parts, because it's already in those two parts in Latin and in French. So that's the history of that one. More recent than we might think.
Yeah.
But writing. Now, where does that come from? I'm not going to give a date, But is that also a Romance word, or is it a word coming from the kind of older history of English, Old English? I think Yvonne will be able to guess this.
I think it's an Old English word.
You're absolutely right. Yes, it is. So it's a word that's found in various forms in lots of Germanic languages. And interestingly, apparently the original meaning of this word in all those Germanic languages was something like to scratch, because of the idea of
inscribing.
Inscribing. That was it. They didn't have the technology of ink and paper. That would be the next best. Well, that would be the best thing.
Yeah.
So that is where we're going there. So in the term creative writing, we've actually got a combination of the two sources of English, the Romance and the Germanic, which to me is a promising thing for creativity. Just one other thing I was interested in. When we did a previous episode, we were using another source, the Thesaurus of Old English, to see if we could identify Old English words that correspond to modern concepts. So I was going back again to that to see if there was an Old English word for creative. And it may be that I didn't search enough, but in the Thesaurus of Old English, it couldn't find anything. The one word I was able to find is the Old English word for poet, which was shop. And that is the word from which we then get shape, create, fashion, like that. And so that's not really used in the context of creative writing anymore. But that was what is interesting about that. And this is what's so fascinating about the OED's etymology sections, I always think. Sometimes they've not been updated for 100 years. So this may be what somebody was suggesting going back to the scholarship of early 20th century, but it's
related to the ship at the end of scholarship and authorship.
I'm not sure that it's related to that. That would be great if it was.
Be nice.
Here's what it suggested it might be related to. Shop meaning fashion, but apparently there is another word that is somewhat similar to that, which is drawing water out of a well. And so you can see that as you read the notes from the in the OED, the etymology person who's writing this, they would really like there to be a connection there. It would be a great one, wouldn't it? If the original word for being a poet meant someone who draws water from a well, but they can't be quite sure. It's just one theory that maybe that was a different word. They just so happen to coincide. And I find that quite a nice way of thinking about creative.
Yeah, I wonder
writing.
when the word poet came in, because poet was used to mean creative writer, really, and
Yes.
people who wrote anything like stories
Yes.
or anything. Because at the end of the 16th century, 1580s-ish, people were writing about the origins of the word poet, and
Yeah.
they were talking about poiesis from Greek.
What we will do is, before the end of this episode, we will look it up in the OED.
Yeah.
And, we'll get the answer to that.
Yeah.
It's a Greek word, as you say,
it's a
isn't
Greek
it?
word, poiesis. Also, poiesis was written
Yes.
as well.
And that means making, doesn't it?
Yeah, making,
Doing.
exactly,
So there's lots of different terms circulating around. I want to come back to creative writing, because that is the one that seems to be the one we use to describe what we're doing, particularly in the context of courses in creative writing and all the different activities that go on. So I was going to start with you, Oz, on this. Actually, I think one of your titles is Professor of Creative Writing.
Yes, on my many.
What are your many titles? Well, yes. And so, which literally means creative writing is something you profess, like people profess a faith. So can you tell us what the term creative writing, what we should understand by it, or what you understand by it?
I think given the time constraints, I suppose the best way to summarise it is just thinking about what language and writing does. And we think of writing as reflecting the world and describing the world and so on, whereas there's the other side of language that creates our world, that brings things into being, that transform not just on the page, but I think our ways of thinking and our ways of approaching the world. And so I suppose I'd just put it in those terms, really. It's language that isn't sort of transactional, descriptive, basically functional, but that are transformative and bring things into the world that aren't there beforehand.
Right, yeah. Bringing things into the world that aren't there before. Which I think goes to
magic.
Yes.
It's magic. It's conjuring.
Well, I was going a different way there. I was going to take it back to the first example of the word creative, where it's a more religious rather than magic thing, where they obviously thought of creation, their reference point was creation of the world, as something that wasn't there before. It occurred to me that creative writing is something that everybody does in some form as they're growing up, because everybody can remember being in primary school, write a story, write a poem, and so on. Then my recollection is that suddenly sort of disappears out of the curriculum as you get towards your GCSEs and A-levels and things like that. And so if it's going to come back, it's going to come back as something that you do more sort of deliberately. And in your cases, it's something that you've gone into a lot, isn't it? It's now become part of a big part of what you do. So I was wondering if you could each say how that came about. What was your kind of journey into creative writing? So it became a thing you chose to do rather than something that everyone in the whole room was doing. So would anyone like to go first? Lucy, do you like to go first?
I remember it quite vividly. I think I was 14 and I was at my grandparents' house, and it was the first non-fiction book that I read on my granddad's bookshelf. It was called Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And I remember being so interested in something that I never thought I'd be interested in, economics and sociology. And I thought, how can I be creative after reading this? And I sort of took it as a challenge. And ever since then, my writing tends to be very research-based, or I enjoy writing based on theories because I enjoy the thrill of non-fiction and being able to go and research that and practice that creatively. And I think I've stuck with that since then.
Right. Can you say a bit more at this point about your PhD? Because you were giving a presentation about it just the other week, and that was really interesting. And the thing that I noticed was it is doing some of what you say, kind of research into non-fiction, but then you're going to have an element where there's going to be something you create as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so the PhD is split into two sections. I have a big creative writing manuscript to hand in at the end, and I also have the critical research thesis, which is a big sort of thesis and dissertation really on the research that I plan to be writing about. So really it's a perfect mix of what I enjoy, the research and the creative writing. If anything, it's really suited to how I like to work.
Right. Yeah, so it does exactly do those two things that you were talking about
exactly.
right back early on. I'm going to ask each of you I'm going to invite each of you to read something that you've written. Do you want to give us what you've got? Lucy.
I brought something along from the first chapter of my PhD.
Oh, great.
So this is the creative part, and I'm writing a novel based on the Renaissance idea of the posthumous muse and immortal lover. So I'll just read a little bit.
That means the person who's died, who then inspires you. Posthumous muse?
In simple terms, yes.
Sorry.
Do you want me to give a definition?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in layman terms, the posthumous muse and immortal lover is the lover of an artist or a writer, which are the two people I'm looking at, captured in absentia from memory as a means to preserve them.
Yes, got it. Bit like Dante and Beatrice.
Yes, I'm going to be looking very closely at those two. And their relationship.
Okay, that's a good, helpful reference point for us.
Okay. He had sought out other means to keep his mind distracted, though none of which provided any longevity of security. George had run himself down so much that he had become a slave to the habitual antidotes he found himself relying on. He didn't sleep well and instead spent the early hours obsessively painting portraits of himself in dark shades and muddy tones of violet. He repeated certain objects around the canvases, mixed the size and colour, but placed them in the same position each time. His figure resided in the middle, by a wash basin, with a red door and an empty chair where he sat in situ. The room had an acute sense of security as the door appeared slightly ajar, as if there was an opportunity for strangers to be allowed in, to fill the space beside him. George, it looked, had little chance of getting out. In the black space behind the red door was room for the labyrinth of his nightmares, and he sat right in front of it in trepidation.
Right. Thank you very much. So George is an artist, is he?
He is, yes.
Right. So, and the novel he's one of the main characters.
He is the lover.
All right. Okay. So it'll be interesting to hear more about that. So thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us. So we are the first people to hear that.
You are actually, yeah.
Great. Okay, so same question to Amina, really, about your experience of becoming someone who does creative writing.
Well, I mean, the first poem that I can consciously remember writing, I was 8, and it was as a response after heavy rain. I was looking at the beetles and the worms, and I wrote about that and Noah's Ark, and I can still remember doing that. And after that, it was something I just did all the time, and I was really interested in writing stories, which I did all through my teens. And then when it got to university, it was only English literature in those days. So I had to do an English degree, but I did the English degree all the time thinking about how it was going to help me be a writer. Obviously then my PhD was in literature again, and I don't regret any of that because I think it's taught me and developed me quite a lot. But all throughout this time I was writing poems occasionally, and then it was great being part of the development of creative writing at this place, which really happened because of the people who were here, as well as the sense that it was a growing field nationally. So it really went from there, really, and getting some publications and so on.
Okay, so you've had several books of poetry published, haven't you?
Yeah.
Was the first one The Ordinariness of Parrots?
Yes, that's the first one, The Ordinariness of Parrots, yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of, it was a very loose collection, but I kind of said it's about perspectives, which is in the title itself. You know, parrots are ordinary to people who have them around all the time, but they might be strange and exotic to people who don't, and that's the point of that poem and the title. And so it's about different kind of perspectives. But I work with art and with music as well, crossovers, ekphrastic work, and I've done a book called Seasons of Myth, which is about... I've done a book called Season of Myths, which is about myths from around the world and reworking them and indeed shaping them into...
I've got it here.
Into
confirm it is Season of Myths.
Yes. It's a reference, of course, to Season of Mists and Mellow Fruitfulness from Keats. And so that was the other... That's a much more cohesive and unified collection because it is about myths. And it's myths from around the world rather than just Greek and Roman myths, which is what almost everybody was doing at the end of the 20th century. And indeed I did for my thesis, but this takes a slightly new direction. Yeah.
So again, there's that same combination of the other things and then the creative...
Absolutely. My thesis was about Ovidian myth in the poetry of Petrarch and Shakespeare. And it combined a lifelong love of myths and stories and folklore and all of those kind of things with a love of poetry. And that was what I was doing. But it was, as I say, a literature PhD.
So is there something you want to share with us now?
Yes, right. So this is a work that I've only recently started. And it's going to be a collection of poems, and it is again going to have a fairly unified theme. And it is a collection of poems about slightly strange creatures in the natural world. And I've been trying to do that for many years, but unable to find a way of articulating these poems rather than going beyond just describing the creatures. And creature, interesting in terms of creative. And so I did find finally the way of approaching it. And so it's going to be about poets who are all described in terms of these creatures. The one I'm going to read is not a strange creature. I think you all recognise it. But it's going to be a collection that is all very self-aware. These poets are very aware of all the famous poems that have come before them. And they're trying not to write the same thing. So this poem is called An Easter Poem. And it goes like this. I saw a poet gallop through a field, full of the fears of spring and nothingness, avoiding wheelbarrows and toxic daffodils, feeding on flesh transformed, fresh air and hope. And there's something in there about flesh being grass, which is a very old phrase. But the flesh transformed has also got that kind of Easter connection.
Yes.
And then obviously avoiding wheelbarrows because of the Red Wheelbarrow poem, and toxic daffodils because of Wordsworth wandering in the field of daffodils. But I actually did find out when I was doing my research for this poem that daffodils are poisonous to horses anyway, so it was just perfect for what I wanted to say. Now, this is a draft, and it may well develop enormously before it's finally finished. And they're all a little bit like that.
Right. Are they all? I mean, that's a very short one.
Yeah, no, they're different lengths.
Oh, I see. Right,
this one might end up being just this short, or it might be longer.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Interestingly, I went to a talk at the Bradford Literature Festival yesterday, and the authors were talking about how the impossibility of writing something novel when you're writing fantasy or sci-fi, even if you think that you're the first one to do it, you likely are not, because it's impossible for you to write something and to read everything that has been written beforehand.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, they say there's only 7 plots, don't they? And everything's been, and there's nothing new under the sun. And I'm very conscious as I say that I'm not even inventing that phrase, So it's just, it's impossible to write something new. But there is a widespread sort of discourse about this, the anxiety of influence, that sort of idea of the writers of the past looking over your shoulder. Milton and the Romantics particularly, I think Harold Bloom particularly talks about them in his book. But so it's kind of anxiety of influence. In fact, that might be in the title eventually, but it isn't. At the moment, it's called The Weirdness of Poets in Their Natural Habitat. That might be a working title.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that work in progress then. So we've got a snapshot of it there. So at this point, we can just reveal that we have looked up the word poet in the Oxford English Dictionary, and the date for the first appearance of that appears to be 1382 or thereabouts. And it's in a Bible context, something to do with Wycliffe's Bible, I think. I won't try and read it. So there we are, 1382. So the middle of the Middle English period.
Very Chaucer period.
Chaucer period.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. So it's Chaucer. Oh yeah, and the third entry in there is Chaucer, The Monk's Tale. Whoso will hear it in a lenger wise, wheeze, readeth the great poet of Itale that hight Dant. So reference to Dante.
Yeah, of course.
So they were
C for Commedia.
Right. Okay. Let's go on then. Oz, can you tell us about your experience of creative writing, not necessarily just poetry, of course.
Yeah, I find these things quite difficult to answer because I don't see things. Amina was just mentioning the 7 plots. I think there's a lot fewer than 7. I think there's one with a variation. But I don't really think in terms of narratives about my life or about art or anything really. It's just sort of things that are all sort of happening at the same time.
Is it true to say narrative is something you don't really like?
It's the least interesting part of creative writing, I think. And I've always been more interested in the language of things than what's going to happen later on. And it's funny with Amina mentioning her Worms in the Rain. And the first thing that I remember writing was a description of a passing train, which was in a little school magazine when I was about, 9 or something. And it wasn't a narrative, it was just a description of an atmosphere, and I wasn't thinking about it. It must have been a school, write something. And I didn't put it into narrative at all. It was all about texture of experience. And I think I've always been interested in that sort of thing. And I suppose the musicality of language as much as what it's telling. I grew up in a house where poetry was a normal thing, which was, I suppose, quite unusual, particularly sort of working-class house of the 60s, just because my grandfather loved the late poets and Robert Burns, that he'd learned loads off the top of his head when he was working as an agricultural worker when he was a lad in the early 20th century.
So he would read them aloud?
He just would recite them. He knew them. And so that, along with sort of folk songs that he'd sing moderately competently, was a very sort of shaping influence on just the daily life, I guess. And so I always sort of poetry was a thing that was around, and I don't really remember it as much from school as I do at home until I sort of got interested myself about probably age 12, I think I started finding poetry that sort of spoke to me in some way, which, I particularly remember Brian Patton discovering his writing, and others of that sort of ilk, not just the Liverpool writers, Pete Brown, who of course died a few weeks ago, that just had these wonderful textures that were about everyday life, but heightened into something almost magical, I think, with Brian Patton particularly. And I just wanted to do that. I was a very quiet, reserved, verging on antisocial child, and so my linguistic world was what I was reading, what I was writing, more than externally. And so it just sort of, by the time I was 12, I was writing quite obsessively, not as obsessively as I do now, but pretty full on most days.
So it's gone on like that ever since then. So it's a
pretty much, yeah. I mean, now it is very disciplined. It's every day and 365 days a year. But and it's because it's what I enjoy. It's something, and I still try to avoid narrative. And I'm more interested in the textures and suggestions and so on.
Is there something you have brought to read?
Yeah, I brought a poem from, and I'll mention that it's from my recent book, A Census of Preconceptions, because it begins with C. So I thought
great.
I'm picking up on all the C's I can
you.
today. And it's sort of about childhood and sort of not. It's called Workers' Playtime. Being too poor to own a car, we'd book a bus trip each bank holiday to the southwest coast or, later, to the moon. The coast had donkeys and fairground rides, but the moon had better rock pools, and Dad and I would spend hours with nets on bamboo canes catching quick fish with bulging eyes and transparent skin, just to see their atom hearts beating before we gently lowered them back to their natural element. I'd fill my pockets with vivid shells that carried voices from deep space, patterned like galaxies, though I knew that back in my bedroom they'd be silent and dark. Most of the shops would be shut, but we'd buy brittle wafers that tasted of vinegar and sea air, then strawberry ice cream in vacuum-sealed packs. We'd break even in the penny arcades, then stand on the shore that in those days seemed to stretch forever, skimming slivers of feldspar in the rough direction of earth. We both doze in our seats on the way home, but I remember the retired cosmonauts singing in Russian at the back of the bus as they passed round Lunar Spirit in an engraved flask. One time, Dad let me try a sip. I can still feel it burning on my tongue.
Wow, thank you very much. That is from your book, A Census of Preconceptions.
Yes, it is indeed. And it's sort of, people have said a little bit about what goes into them. It's a prose poem, and it's a form that I have been, I'm sort of, first prose poem I ever read was by Brian Patton in that famous anthology, The Merseyside. I mean, it's a form that I've written on and off, and I think even that sort of 9-year-old stuff was edging towards prose poetry, even though I'd never heard of it at the time. But I've been working very much in that medium for about 7 years now, I think, particularly, including, and just to tie things together, co-editing the Varney Press Anthology of Prose Poetry with Anne Caldwell, C for Caldwell.
C for co-editing.
Co-editing, yeah. Which also, amongst the writers in it, include Simon Armitage, who we're going to talk about in a bit. So it all links together, you see. And it's sort of...
Not as a narrative.
No, just as a sort of metamorphic coagulation, like the devils in Dante that are taking different demonic forms and so on. So we're back to the commedia again and so on. because I do think everything is connected in some way if you sort of look hard enough, and that's sort of how I go about writing. Really, I suppose it is finding those unlikely connections, and so it's very much partly reminiscing about when I was a kid and we didn't have a car, and my dad worked for a garage, and they'd have a works outing. And we would come back at night, and there would be the younger blokes in the back all drunk and singing. But at the same time, it was at the era of the sort of space exploration and so on. And so they get blurred and they sort of like pass into each other as well. So, and they're all as true as everything, because memory is as true, whatever happens, isn't it? And you create your own world through creative writing, and it brings into being something which sort of existed and sort of didn't.
It sort of reminded me a little bit of like song lyrics, but not just any song lyrics, like the people who sort of convey an emotion, but there's no story being told. It's just sort of like an emotion, and they do it really effectively. So it sort of reminded me a little bit of those sort of song lyrics.
The other big influence, sorry, I won't make this all talking about me, but I love music as well. And another writer who was really a huge influence on me that I discovered in my early teens was a guy called Robert Calvert, who only wrote 2 very slim books in his lifetime, although there's being edited a 3-volume collected works, which will be coming out, I think, this year, maybe next year, I believe. It's just being held over time and time again. But he also wrote song lyrics as well, and was very involved in on the fringes of the sort of underground publishing in the late 60s, early 70s, and the sort of very on the fringe of the sort of new world science fiction, new wave stuff of the 60s and 70s.
Is he associated with a particular band?
Particularly Hawkwind, who I could go off at great length on that. Because
it may have to be with the H episode.
That would be the H. But again, it's that overlap between songs and poetry, and you could do a big thing on what is the difference between the song lyric and a poem. But yeah, so music has been a real influence as well.
Okay, well, thank you. And you've given us another C there. C is for Robert Calvert, and also C is for an important word, connected. So that's really, really good. Right. Well, that's going to be the end of our first part of this C is for Creative Writing episode. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for your contributions there. But we will be right back with the second part, where we are going to think a little bit more about creative writing, particularly in a class context, and then also we're going to look at that coronation poem. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.